I guess to start with, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Jonathan.
Had a chance to have to peruse the manifesto that's come out today. I guess to start with, why today? What prompted the release?
New year, new vision, and building on initiatives that we have been developing in previous years.
There's been a quiet period for the People's Campaign. About how long has the group been sort of, I guess, reassessing where to go with its plans?
I mean, working?
Yeah.
Well, we've been working, so the issue is no different from what we have done in the past. Initially, when we were formed, we had a vision of being more of a collaborative, policy-oriented entity and not so much reserving the advocacy role. And then having exhausted those avenues, we then were forced to resort to more advocacy. And so we have resumed. This document is in fact more of a policy document than it is a manifesto. And so the document itself builds upon the framework that was affirmed by the people when we formulated the manifesto, and so the time that we've spent in between has been focusing on trying to translate some of the broader goals of the People's Campaign into more of a narrow defined policy initiatives. And this is what we have, this is the framework for that step.
In terms, and there are some interesting things in there. There were a few of the policies that we were looking at that I was hoping to get you to expand upon. To do with I guess we'll start in no particular order, but we'll start with the livable wage. Can we expand a bit on what we're looking at with that? For example, are we talking minimum wage, for example?
No, I think from the perspective, and Brother Chris can speak to this too, from the perspective of the People's Campaign, there's a very hard distinction between a living wage and a minimum wage. Mm-hmm. And most jurisdictions reduce living wages to a conversation about glorified minimum wages. So we take the position that a living wage has to be part of an overall structural adjustment that does not just include labor and wages, but it has a number of attendant issues in order to make sure that it produces equality or addresses the issue of inequality. Chris can.
Well, I think you take that point a bit further. When you look at page 4 of the manifesto, it said every person should be entitled to a living wage in proportion to the cost of living. So when you look at the inequality that's just not just happened here in Bermuda, but in other countries all around the world, this inequality is a real issue, and we need to sit down and address that. And recognizing that if someone right now is earning, let's say, $1,000 a week, but yet when we look at the household expenditure is $1,807 up to 2013. We're not in 2018. So what does the household expenditure look like now? Is it going over $2,000? And if it is, what's going to be the real, livable wage that we need to come up with? And there's a combination of a number of things, whether or not we know that employers are not going to be able to afford to give somebody a 50% wage increase to put them, or a 100% wage increase, take your wage from $1,000 to $1,000. So we'll look at all those different variables that's going to help to make up that living wage.
And I think when you look, for example, at work that has been done by people like Joe Stiglitz, who produced a report that later became a book called Changing the Rules. And Joe Stiglitz was a former leader in the IMF and the World Bank, renowned Pulitzer Prize winning economist. And he says that basically inequality in a society is a choice. And we tend to function as if financial rules and corporate rules and distribution of wealth are somehow natural laws, as opposed to policy consequences of choices and priorities that are set by governments and people. And so he argues, and we tend to agree with the argument, that there has to be the moral courage and the will to make a commitment to engage in structural adjustment, of which wages is one component.
That's correct.
Yeah, I saw the workforce equity that was suggested in that. It's obviously, you've seen that discussed before, and there were some exciting implications for it. It didn't end up going ahead. When you're putting this forward, are you looking at the same model as what came before, or can you, I guess again, just expand on what's being put forward when we talk about workforce equity?
You talking about employment?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that when you look at, I think our manifesto, and once again, that's also on page 4, it talks about full employment for Bermudians must be a national priority. I think that the government has made a decision to look at making sure Bermudians can be fully employed in their country, and I think that is correct. I think that looking at the various, I think they're looking at to get certain trades or all the trades certified to make sure we've got whether it's certified plumbers, certified electricians, certified, you know, in the field, to make sure that, you know, if an employer is now saying I need to bring in a certified electrician, the government wants to be in a position, you know what, we've got 30 qualified electricians over here. There's no need for you to bring anybody in, and I think that's a very positive thing, recognizing that there are some people see some drawbacks in that, but I think right now we want to be able to have, I'm not sure whether they can have any control right now as it relates to immigration, knowing exactly how many work permits are out there on electricians or whatever have you, but certainly I think with this, maybe the new system, we can have a better control over work permits as to how many people we're bringing in different trades, and are they really needed.
And I also think that the government has gone some way toward attempting to reconcile some of the gaps that existed in workforce development as it has functioned up to this point, to begin to try to ensure that the kinds of training that people receive when they enter workforce development is targeted to areas of work where there is a demand and a need for people to be employed, or areas that are underserved. And so these are initiatives that are currently under review, and I believe that the new government has gone some distance toward developing a reformed or new initiative in terms of understanding how to make all of the parts that are involved in workforce development function in a way that will create opportunity for Bermudians that are seeking to re-enter the workforce.
I think when you look at the national training plan as it relates to, you know, there's a few positive initiatives in that. One of the positive initiatives that I saw in there was as relates to, you know, this whole question about entry-level positions. I think our biggest concern is to make sure that, if bartenders are clearest category in the immigration policy or in the immigration, policies and procedures, then if it's going to be a clearest category, then that's enough. If the hotels were allowed to get rid of this entry-level positions, that's enough. You got to know at some point in time we're going to want short of bartenders. So we're going to have to look to bring people in. So the mere fact that they're looking at reinstituting these entry-level positions within the different trades, is a very positive thing.
And there was, yes, okay. And there was an interesting line that I saw in there where we were discussing strengthening the power of complaints for police and corrections. There was a meeting some time back to discuss the ramifications of the pepper spray and all the madness that happened on December 2nd. Has this area of the initiative, does it come out of what happened on December 2nd and the dissatisfaction that some people had with the...
Well, the policy initiatives contained in the document actually precede December 2nd, but certainly the events on December the 2nd would fall into a category of something that we feel could have been more justly addressed by an effective or more equitable or fairer police complaints review process.
Within the context of talking about tougher immigration policies, is there room for discussion, or is the campaign looking at term limits, was something that came up under the previous PLP administration? Some welcomed it, in some ways it was controversial, and it was early when the OBA came in, it was just axed. Is the People's Campaign looking at reviving that conversation?
Well, I think at this point, because the People's Campaign were involved in the Pathways to Status issue, and the working group that was a result of that was then transformed into another policy type group that advises or functions as a conduit through which policy initiatives and recommendations were made to the Department of Immigration. And so I think that because there's a process in place and there are already items that have been outlined as part of that process, then I'm sure that when the Minister of Home Affairs begins to look at comprehensive immigration reform, that will be among the issues, and they will engage in the proper kind of consultation with a broad base in the community in order to be able to address that issue effectively.
And remember, that's one of the things that even before the Pathways to Status came about, the People's Campaign was having a conversation with the OBA government about comprehensive immigration reform. That we felt that, you know, if we had comprehensive immigration reform, then some of these issues we're facing now, you know, I'm not saying they would all be eliminated, but most of them will be eliminated, would have been eliminated.
Again, I only had time to really just read through it, but one item that looked interesting as well was there was a point in there about bringing cooperatives. I was hoping to hear a bit more on that.
Well, certainly I think that if you look at, you know, we had a cooperative supermarket here that even though it closed about 10 or 12 years ago, but certainly I think that the idea of cooperatives are working in other jurisdictions, and we see no reason why, you know, they can't work here. Looking at, I think what has transpired over the past 2 to 3 years, people were quite upset with some of the things that were taking place, and they were crying out for another co-op shop or some kind of initiative so we can come together. So the corporate initiative, I think, has always been on the table. It's just a matter of what we do about it.
Oh yeah, sorry, backtracking a little bit. Price control, I mean, that's something that comes up again and again, and then there's always pushback from the likes of supermarkets and importers and things about the high cost of doing business in Bermuda. How do you strike a balance with that?
Well, it's not a matter of striking a balance. I think that when we look at, and you know, the figures speak for themselves, when we look at the way the cost of living has risen in this country from 1974 up until now, I can tell you that, you know, back in 1974, compared to rents now, rents are probably going up, you know, up until 2013. I think they've risen something like 1,000%. Now, how many people can say the wages are actually going up 1,000% over that same period of time? You might find your wages going up 400%, and if you're lucky, it may have gone up 600%, but it's still not going up 1,000%. So based on that one I will learn, and we've got that in this document where we talked about shelter. So that, you know, some control has to be put on, you know, on rent. Some control has to be put on the ability for when you say you mark up food items. I mean, I think it's a well-known fact to me that most things that are bought in are marked up between 100% to 300%. Some items could go up even higher than that. And once we do understand that, you know, whether it's a grocery store or whether it's somebody who's bringing something that's got to cover the cost, aside from covering your cost up to, let's say, 100%, what's the need for the 200% markup? What's the need for the 300% markup? What's the need for that? You tell us that. Because certainly if I can go overseas and get that item for $1, and you're bringing it in for $1 and selling it for $4, which is a 300% markup, why the 300% markup? If you're covering your wages and the cost of land out of Bermuda, and let's just say that cost is 70%. So now, you know, when you look at that cost, it should be, you know, let's say it's 170%. So you're covering the initial cost of $1, it's going up by 70. Why the other 230%? What's that for? Or 130%, even if it's $3 instead of $4.
And in addition to that, I think that the misnomer is that we don't have price control. We do have price control. The question is who controls the price. So all we're saying is you have one corner of the community or the economy that does control those prices. They determine amongst themselves what those prices are going to be, what those margins are going to be. What we're saying is, in a democracy, it is a government that is entrusted by the people to represent the interests of the people, and it is in the interest of the people not to be exploited by a monopoly on food prices, for example. And part of trying to create or reduce inequality means not only dealing with the issue of wages, but also dealing with the issue of the cost of food, dealing with the issue of cost of healthcare and medicine. And in order for a living wage not to be reduced to a glorified minimum wage, it means that adjustments are going to have to be made in a number of different areas in order to produce greater equity.
And let me tell you why what Reverend Tweed saying is true. I can tell you, I'll use one particular item, and I'll pick, let's say, supermarket A, for example, right? That price for this one item was $5.25. The same item at a next store was $5.25. Now that same item at store A is going up to $5.35, which is going up by 10 cents. But at this other store now, that item's going up to $6.80. So how do you justify taking that item from $5.25 to $6.80? That's one item, one example. And that's why we're talking about ducking trillion prices. And that should not be happening. Because if that one item was $5.25 before and it was $5.25 at both stores, why the significant change?
And that doesn't even take into consideration the fact that some of the people who import stuff may be getting duty concessions and other kinds of concessions. So there are other ways that you can try to reduce their costs to import stuff without passing it on to people who can afford it least.
Looking at the state of play in Bermuda right now, what stands out to you as the most urgent item, the most important thing to deal with that's on the minds of the Bermudian people right now?
I can't really tell you what's on the minds of people, but I can tell you that the way that I perceive the economy is that clearly fiscal stability is a major issue in Bermuda, given what's happening globally in terms of shifts in priorities in Britain and Europe and the United States with respect to how they're dealing with corporate entities that use offshore entities to shield their finances. So clearly that's an issue that will have an impact. But I also think that for an average Bermudian who is not in the corporate sphere and may not actually get any residual benefit from the billions of dollars that pass through Bermuda in that way, major issues that are confronting average Bermudians do deal with issues like access to health care, cost of medicine, the ability to pay a mortgage, the ability to purchase food for your family, access to education, a job. So these are the kinds of issues that I see as being priorities for most of the people, at least that I serve in Bermuda.
And I think that boils right back to this whole question of this inequality that's taking place, not just here in this country, but in other places all around the world. And I think that if we can sit down and address this inequalities, people will feel a lot better that, you know, the quality of life is a lot better than it was. And I think that, you know, I think we were forced to address this inequality now because whilst it has been around for, you know, the last 5 or 10 years and for whatever reason we haven't chosen to address it, now we're actually forced to address it because people are saying, you know what, this inequality is really something that we need to have a conversation about, and also not just have a conversation about it, but we need to have some real results in relationship to this inequality.
This one of your main members, Brother Jason Hayward, is now in the government. How do you see his role panning out within government? There's some people that say, oh, it's going to be a conflict of interest, but you could also ask if he'll be able to go to bat in a different way in his new role.
You know what? Conflict of interest. You know what I find so interesting is that, you know, and I'll go back to when David Gibbons was the Premier of Bermuda back in 1980-81. Yeah, I know. But remember now, he's also Minister of Finance, but he is chairman for Gibbons Company. Why is it that, those individuals can have those kind of rules and there not be a conflict of interest? Let's use the current Grant Gibbons right now, who, is now an MP. Not sure if it's the shadow minister of finance, but remember now, Grant Gibbons, Dr. Grant Gibbons, resigned from being the educational officer so he can go and be the chairman for, or whatever role he played in the America's Cup situation. He resigned from education so he can go over and play that role. So it wasn't a conflict for him, and if it weren't a conflict for him, why should it not be a conflict for Brother Jason if some of the things that he needs to achieve on behalf of his members or on behalf of some of the people who he was representing in the People's Campaign, why should it be a conflict of interest? I don't see it as a conflict of interest.
And I think given the history, especially of the previous government, with all of the business interests that they've had and all of the many ways in which they were a feeder entity for all of their associations and associates, I think that there are members in the previous government that clearly had material interests in the legislation that was being passed. And I think the one thing that nobody, I believe, can say, and I dare anybody to prove me otherwise, there's absolutely no piece of legislation that I can envision where Senator Haywood would have a material benefit from a piece of legislation passing. So from my perspective, I don't see Senator Haywood as having any kind of conflict of interest. He has been entrusted to serve the people. He knows who he is serving, just like all of the other people up in the House know who they're serving, and in the Senate are representing a constituency. And I dare say that Brother Jason will do it as good or better than most.
I have to ask it because I know it'll be on people's minds with the reemergence of the People's Campaign, or into prominence. You were tough on the previous administration on the OBA. Will you be as tough on the new administration as you were on them?
We weren't tough on the OBA. We were tough on policy, and we were tough for the people that we represent, and that has not changed and will not change.
Well, let's take that point a bit further. If we sit down with the Premier of the country back then, which was, the Honorable Michael Dunkley, and we say that we want to have dialogue and we want to have, collaboration, and we want to sit down and have a conversation about, comprehensive immigration reform, and then it looks like they're just like spinning our wheels while we're talking to you or listening to you, but we're not really hearing. Then that's enough. The relationship changed from one to something else. Recognizing that, where the People's Campaign for Equality, Jobs, and Justice was established just for that, to make sure that, the equality, jobs, and justice is, justice, it's something that we don't take for granted. So what we're asking the current government to do is to make sure that they listen to the people. They were given a clear mandate on July 18th, a clear mandate, and now it's not a mandate to use, not abuse. And I've said this to the Prime Minister. I'm not telling you anything that I'm not said to him. Has been given the government of the day has been given a mandate to use, not abuse. So it's not like they're going to be dictatorial and going around doing certain things or whatever. As long as they use that mandate in accordance with what the people gave it to them, they will be fine.
And I think, democracy is a partnership. It is a social contract between the people and those who have been entrusted to serve the people. And as long as that contract is honored and not violated, and I think the previous administration ran into problems because the majority of people began to believe that that contract had been violated, and therefore it produced this historic landslide victory. And so the current government is fully aware of the support and the trust that has been placed in them, and also the expectation that that social contract will be honored in order to move the island forward and to do what is in the best interest of the people of Bermuda. And
that social contract is not something that's made-believe, it's a document that speaks about the social contract between the government and its people. And when a government violates that social contract, that's why you have the unrest that you've had over the past 2 years plus under the UBA government. And that's why they are no longer the government, because of social unrest.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. I guess the last question that I had is, what's next? What will we see from the People's Campaign coming forward?
What's next is Saturday. Saturday is next. The People's Campaign will continue to work, and clearly there are some policy pieces that we believe will be in the best interest of the people that we represent, and we'll be working in collaboration with the people and with the government and all other persons of goodwill who desire to try to move the country forward in a positive way, to try to bring about some of those changes in order to try to create the stability and fulfill the promise and hope that people invested with the new government.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you gentlemen about that
you're
you'd
good.
like to cover with us?
No, we're good.
Thanks very much for taking the time.
Sure.
Greatly appreciate it.